The last time Mount Fuji erupted, the ground shook first. That eruption, in 1707, began just 49 days after one of the largest earthquakes in Japanese history. So when a shallow magnitude 5.6 struck directly beneath Fuji at 10:29 at night, hours after another quake rattled Tokyo, an entire nation felt the weight of that history. The mountain sits on the most complicated collision of plates on Earth, 3 great slabs meeting under a single sleeping giant. There is no eruption, no tsunami, no sign magma is rising, and yet the knot moved twice in one day. What were the instruments around Fuji really recording, and how do you tell an ordinary tremor from a warning? One thing before we get into it. If you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and leave a comment with where you're tuning in from tonight. Let's dive in. Part 1. Twice. In one day. At 10:29 at night, the ground moved at the foot of Mount Fuji. Not a tremor you have to squint to feel, not a flicker on a seismograph that only a specialist would notice. This was shaking strong enough that standing up became difficult, strong enough to slide furniture across the floor, strong enough to throw objects off shelves and crack the weaker walls of older buildings. And it happened in the dark, in the quiet hours, in the one place on the surface of this planet where you least want to feel the Earth come alive. The magnitude was 5.6, maybe 5.7, depending on which agency you trust. And I already know what some of you are thinking because I thought it too. 5.6. In a week where we have been watching a country torn apart by a pair of quakes above magnitude 7, where the death toll keeps climbing and whole towers have folded into the street, a 5.6 sounds almost gentle. Set it aside. Move on. Nothing to see here. Do not do that. Do not wave this one away because the number is the least interesting thing about it. The story tonight is not how big this earthquake was. The story is exactly where it happened, and what is stacked up underneath that single point on the map. This earthquake struck near the Fuji Five Lakes, at the northern base of the volcano, almost directly above the magma system that feeds one of the most watched mountains on Earth. That is why a so-called small quake just put an entire nation on edge. Think about what it means to feel an earthquake at the foot of a volcano specifically, because the location does something to the human mind that no datasheet can capture. If you feel the ground shake in open country, your fear has nowhere in particular to go. But if you feel it at the base of a mountain that everyone in the country knows can erupt, the fear finds an immediate target, and the mind races up the slope to the crater and asks the oldest question our species has ever asked of a volcano. Is it waking? That question is hardwired into us. For as long as people have lived near these mountains, a shaking ground beneath a volcano has meant danger, and that instinct does not switch off, just because we now have seismographs and satellites. So when the Earth moved beneath Fuji at 10:30 at night, the alarm that rippled outward was not only physical, it was ancient, the reflexive dread of a sleeping giant stirring, and that dread is part of why this story travelled around the world before the dust had even settled. And yet the same instinct that makes us watch is the instinct we have to discipline, because fear is a smoke detector, not a diagnosis. It is very good at telling us to pay attention. It is terrible at telling us what is actually happening. The job of the rest of this video is to take that flash of ancient dread and hold it up against the modern evidence, to honour the instinct that says watch the mountain while refusing to let it run ahead of the facts. Because the facts, as we will see, tell a calmer story than the instinct fears, even as the setting, that tangle of plates beneath a sleeping giant, justifies why the instinct fired in the first place. Holding those two things together, the alarm and the evidence, is the whole art of nights like this one. And here is the part that makes it stranger. This was not the only earthquake to hit central Japan that day, it was the second. Earlier, in the early afternoon, shortly before 1 o'clock, another quake had already rattled the region, this one east of Tokyo, felt by millions of people across the capital, buildings swaying, pulses racing. 2 significant earthquakes in one country in a single day, bracketing the morning and the night like a pair of warning shots. I want you to hold both of those in your mind at once, because that is the thread that runs through everything we're about to talk about. 2 quakes, one day, one of the most complicated tangles of moving rock anywhere on the planet. The question is not whether either one was a disaster on its own, because neither was. The question is what it means when the most dangerous tectonic knot on Earth shudders twice in 12 hours, and one of those shudders lands directly under a sleeping giant. I want you to picture the night itself, because the human reality of it is easy to lose behind the numbers. The Fuji Five Lakes region is not a city of towers. It is a quieter place of small towns, lakeside resorts, and homes scattered around the northern base of the mountain, the kind of place where people go to sleep early, and the loudest sound is usually the wind off the water. And into that quiet at 10:30 at night, the ground simply detonated. People who were asleep were thrown awake by their own houses shaking around them. Dishes walked off shelves and shattered. Doors swung. The low structural groan of buildings under stress filled the dark. For the length of that shaking, every person in that region lived inside the one experience that no amount of preparation ever fully tames. The experience of the solid earth becoming liquid beneath you. And then it stopped, and they were left lying in the dark, listening, wondering whether that was the end of it or the beginning of something worse. Now layer on the context, because the timing made it land even harder. This was not a calm week interrupted by a single shock. This was a stretch of days when the whole world of earth science already felt loud, when one country had been gutted by a pair of enormous quakes, and the rescue crews were still pulling people from the rubble, when the news was already saturated with the language of disaster. Against that backdrop, a 5.6 can feel like background noise, easy to scroll past. But the people at the foot of Fuji did not get to scroll past it. They felt it in their bones, in the dark, in the one place on Earth where a moving ground carries an extra weight of meaning. And that gap between how small the number looks from far away and how large the moment felt from inside it is exactly the gap this whole video is built to close. Let me be clear about what we know and what we do not, right at the start, because the difference matters, and I am not here to sell you fear. Mount Fuji is not erupting. There is no confirmed eruption. There is no tsunami warning. There is no official signal that magma is breaking through toward the surface. The scientists who watch this region have not raised the alarm. What we have is a tectonic earthquake, a movement of the crust, in a place where the crust is under more competing pressure than almost anywhere else in the world. But that reassurance comes with a shadow attached. And the shadow is the whole reason this video exists. The reason the world's eyes snapped to Yamanashi the moment that second quake hit is that this volcano sits at the meeting point of forces so large and so tangled that calling it complicated almost undersells it. When the ground moves here, you cannot simply file it away as routine, because nothing about the machinery under Mount Fuji is routine. So before this night is over, we are going to take that knot apart strand by strand and find out what actually moved. Let us start with the moment the mountain itself felt the jolt. Part 2, Intensity 6, at the foot of the mountain. The second earthquake struck at 10:29 at night local time, and it announced itself across eastern Yamanashi Prefecture and the Fuji Five Lakes region, with a violence that does not match the modest number on the magnitude scale. I keep coming back to that mismatch because it is the key to the whole night. On the Japanese intensity scale, the scale that measures not the energy at the source, but the actual shaking where people live, this event reached a maximum of 6, and 6 is not a number you shrug at. Let me put intensity 6 into your body for a second, because the abstract figure does not do it justice. At intensity 6 on the Japanese scale, you cannot stand up without holding onto something. Heavy furniture, the kind you do not think of as movable, slides and topples, objects fly off shelves, tiles can come loose, weaker walls crack and, in the worst cases, fail. People who have lived through it describe the disorientation of a floor that will not stay still beneath their feet, the sound of a house complaining around them, the animal panic of a body that suddenly cannot trust the ground. Now put that in the middle of the night, when people are asleep, when the dark removes every reference point, and you understand why this rattled nerves far beyond the epicenter. The depth is the next piece, and it cuts against the reassurance in an important way. This quake was shallow. The readings put it at roughly 20 kilometers down, about 12 miles, and some of the more detailed seismic records place it even nearer to 12 kilometers from the surface. Shallow earthquakes hit harder at the surface than far down ones of the same size because the energy has less rock to travel through before it reaches you. So you take a magnitude that sounds unremarkable, you bring it up close to the surface, and you get shaking that makes a region of millions sit bolt upright in the dark. That is how a 5.6 becomes an intensity 6. It is worth pausing on what intensity 6 means for the buildings themselves, because Japan's structures are the hidden reason a night like this did not become a catastrophe. At intensity 6, ordinary construction in much of the world would be in serious trouble, with older walls failing and poorly built structures at risk of partial collapse. In Japan, the building stock has been hardened by generations of hard lessons, so most modern structures ride out intensity 6 with cracked plaster and frightened occupants rather than collapse. That gap between what intensity 6 does to an unprepared building and what it does to a Japanese one is the difference between a tragedy and a long, sleepless night. So when I tell you the shaking was strong enough to damage weaker walls, understand that the weaker walls are the exception in this country, not the rule, and that the relative calm of the aftermath is a credit to decades of engineering rather than a sign that the shaking was mild. It was not mild, it was survived, which is a very different thing. That distinction runs underneath this entire story, the difference between an event being small and an event being survived well. Tonight's quake was not small. It delivered serious shaking to a populated region beside a major volcano in the middle of the night. What made it pass without disaster was not the gentleness of the earth, but the readiness of the people standing on it. I want you to hold that, because it changes how you should hear every reassuring thing I'm about to say. Calm does not mean nothing happened. It means something happened, and a prepared society absorbed it. That is the texture of life on the most dangerous tectonic knot on the planet, where the ground is anything but gentle, and survival is a thing that has to be built, deliberately, in advance. And then there is the location, which is the reason we are all here. The epicenter sat near the Fuji Five Lakes, in the area around Oshino, at roughly 35.5 degrees north and just under 139 degrees east. If you have ever seen the postcard image of Mount Fuji reflected in still water, with cherry blossoms in the foreground, you have been looking at this region. It is the northern base of the volcano. It is, quite literally, the ground the mountain stands on. And on this night, that ground moved. Remember the thread that ties this whole story together. It is not the size of the quake, it is the address. An identical earthquake out in the open ocean, far from anything, would be a footnote in a database, noticed by no one but seismologists. The same earthquake at the foot of a volcano that has been silent for more than 300 years becomes a headline that races around the world within minutes. Same energy, completely different meaning, and the difference is entirely about what is buried beneath the spot where it happened. Let me also explain why the shallow depth matters so much, because it is one of those details that quietly changes everything. When an earthquake happens far down, the energy it releases has to travel up through many kilometers of rock before it reaches the surface, and along that journey it spreads out and weakens like a shout muffled through thick walls. But when an earthquake happens close to the surface, that energy arrives almost undiminished, sharp and concentrated, hammering directly upward into whatever sits above it. That is why a shallow quake of modest magnitude can shake harder, right at the epicenter, than a far larger quake that ruptured tens of kilometers down. Tonight's Fuji event was that shallow kind. 12 to 20 kilometers is not far when you're talking about the crust, and the people directly above it caught the energy at nearly full strength. The intensity 6 they felt was the geometry of the thing, a moderate amount of energy delivered from close range, straight up into the ground they were standing on. And the Japanese intensity scale itself is worth understanding, because it is doing something different from the magnitude you usually hear quoted. Magnitude is a single number describing the energy at the source, the same no matter where you measure it. Intensity, by contrast, describes the actual shaking at a specific place, and it changes from town to town depending on distance and the kind of ground underneath. The Japanese scale, called Shindo, runs from 0 up to 7, with the upper levels split into lower and upper grades to capture fine distinctions. An intensity 4, like the one Tokyo felt in the afternoon, is widely noticeable. Hanging lamps swing, sleeping people wake, but it rarely damages well-built structures. An intensity 6, like the one near Fuji at night, is in a different league entirely, the level where standing becomes hard, heavy furniture moves, and weaker buildings start to suffer. The fact that a 5.6 produced a 6 on that scale tells you, all by itself, how close and how shallow this rupture really was. Now, the responsible thing, and I'm going to keep doing this throughout, is to tell you immediately what this shaking did not come with. There was no tsunami warning, which makes sense for an inland quake of this type. There was no confirmed eruption. There were no reports, at least in the first records, of magma forcing its way upward. What there was, and what continued through the hours that followed, was a sequence of aftershocks, the smaller adjustments that always follow when a piece of the crust slips. Aftershocks by themselves are normal. They are the ground settling its accounts. But near a volcano, the character of those aftershocks, where they go and what kind they are, becomes something scientists watch very, very carefully. And we will get to exactly what they are listening for. First, we have to answer the obvious objection, the one I raised at the very start. If it was only a 5.6, why does any of this matter at all? Part 3. Why a 5.6 is the wrong thing to measure. Let me say the uncomfortable thing out loud, because you're probably still half thinking it. Japan gets earthquakes constantly. It is one of the most seismically active countries on the planet. A magnitude 5.6 in isolation is not rare and is not, on its own, a catastrophe. Japan is also, without much argument, the best prepared nation on Earth when it comes to earthquakes. Its building codes are written in the blood of past disasters. Its early warning system can put an alert on your phone seconds before the shaking arrives. So why am I asking you to take a moderate quake seriously when the country it hit is practically engineered to absorb exactly this kind of blow? Because magnitude is the wrong ruler for this particular story. Magnitude measures how much energy was released at the source. It is a fine number for comparing one earthquake to another in the abstract. But it tells you almost nothing about consequence, and consequence is always a product of three things: how big, how close, and what is underneath. Tonight, the how big is unremarkable. It is the how close and the what is underneath that should have your attention, because on both of those this quake scores about as high as a quake can. Think about what we just established. This was shallow, which maximizes the shaking felt at the surface. It was close to a region where over 1 million people live in the shadow of the mountain, and it was directly above one of the most pressurized, most tangled sections of crust anywhere in the world. You do not need a large magnitude to make a meaningful statement when you strike a spot like that. A light tap on the right place can mean more than a hard blow on the wrong one, and the foot of Mount Fuji is very much the right place to make us pay attention. Consider how Japan itself treats this distinction, because the country's own warning systems are built around exactly this truth. When the early warning network fires, it is not simply reacting to magnitude. It is racing to estimate how strong the shaking will be at each specific location, because that is what determines whether a train needs to stop or a factory line needs to pause. The whole apparatus of earthquake safety in Japan is an admission, encoded in technology, that where and how strong at the surface matters more for human survival than the single headline number. The engineers who built that system understand perfectly that a moderate quake in the wrong place can do more harm than a great quake in the right one. They have spent decades and enormous sums designing around precisely the principle I am asking you to absorb tonight. So when I tell you to stop fixating on the 5.6, I am not inventing a contrarian take. I am repeating the operating philosophy of the most earthquake-literate society on the planet. And there is a deeper reason the location obsesses the experts here, beyond the shaking it produced. It is that this particular location is information. A quake out in the empty ocean tells you mainly that the ocean floor moved. A quake at the foot of Fuji tells you that the most tangled junction on Earth just released strain, at a spot coupled to a sleeping volcano, in a region whose every tremor feeds models that scientists use to understand what the knot is doing over time. Each event here is a data point in a very long, very patient effort to read a system we still do not fully understand. The shaking fades in seconds, but the information lasts, folded into the slow accumulation of knowledge about a place that matters enormously and reveals itself only one quake at a time. That is another reason a modest event here is never wasted attention. It is a sentence in a conversation the Earth has been having with us for a very long time. Here is the reframe I want you to carry for the rest of this video. Stop asking how strong was it. Start asking where did it happen, and what does that location know that we are still trying to figure out. Because the honest answer is that this quake landed on a junction so complex that even the experts do not fully agree on every fault and every stress path running through it. When the ground moves in a place we do not completely understand, the smart response is not panic and it is not dismissal. It is attention. Sharp, sustained, humble attention. And that location, the foot of Fuji, is not just complicated by accident. It is complicated because it sits at the exact spot where several of the largest moving pieces of the planet's outer shell are grinding into one another at the same time. Most places on Earth deal with one plate boundary. This place deals with a collision of collisions. That is what earns it the title of the most dangerous tectonic knot on the planet, and it is the reason a sleeping volcano was ever able to grow here in the first place. Let me give you a way to feel the difference between magnitude and consequence, because once it clicks, you will never read an earthquake headline the same way again. History is full of moderate earthquakes that caused outsized harm because of where they struck, and enormous earthquakes that caused almost none because they ruptured far out at sea or beneath empty land. A magnitude 5 in the wrong place, under an old, unreinforced town in shallow crust, can take lives. A magnitude 8 in the right place, far offshore, far down, away from people, can pass with barely a ripple in the news. The number on the magnitude scale is only one of 3 dials, and it is often the least decisive of the 3. The other 2, how close it struck to people, and what kind of ground and what kind of structures sat above it, usually decide whether an earthquake is a footnote or a tragedy. Tonight, 2 of those 3 dials, closeness and what lies beneath, were turned all the way up. And there is a humility built into this that I think is the most important part. We are talking about a junction so complicated that the experts themselves do not fully agree on every fault and every stress path threading through it. This is not a place where we have the whole map and can confidently say, that crack there, that is the only one that can move. It is a place where ruptures sometimes happen, on faults nobody had even charted, where the interaction of 3 plates produces stresses that are genuinely hard to model. When the ground moves in a place we only partly understand, the worst possible responses are the 2 easy ones, blind panic and lazy dismissal. Panic ignores the fact that the most likely outcome is that nothing more happens. Dismissal ignores the fact that we are not standing on solved, settled ground. The mature response, the one that actually matches the situation, is attention, the willingness to keep watching a place precisely because it still has the power to surprise us. That is the posture I want to model for you tonight, and it is the posture the scientists themselves are taking. So before we can understand what happened tonight, we have to understand the machine. We have to go down, below the lakes, below the foundations of the mountain, into the place where 3 of the great plates of the earth meet and fight. Because once you see how that knot is tied, the shaking stops looking like a random event and starts looking like the inevitable groan of a structure under impossible strain. Let me show you the plates. Part 4. A collision of collisions. Japan does not sit on a fault. I want to start here because it is the single most important idea in this entire story, and most people get it wrong. We tend to picture earthquake country as a place with a crack running through it, one line where 2 slabs of rock slide past each other. California has something close to that picture with its famous fault. But Japan is not that. Japan sits on a stack. It sits on a pile-up of moving plates that interact not just at the surface, but far below it, layered over one another like sheets of metal being forced through a press. And nowhere in that pile-up is the pressure more concentrated than directly under the spot that shook tonight. Let me name the players, because once you see them you cannot unsee the danger. To the east of Japan, the Pacific Plate, the largest tectonic plate on the planet, is diving down and under, sinking beneath the edge of the continent along a feature called the Japan Trench. This is subduction, the process where one slab of the Earth's crust slides beneath another and plunges back toward the interior. It is the most powerful earthquake engine that exists. It is the exact machine that produced the catastrophe of 2011, the magnitude 9 event off Tohoku that sent a wall of water over the coast and changed how the entire world thinks about these disasters. That engine runs right along Japan's eastern flank every single day. Now bring in the second player. To the south, another great slab, the Philippine Sea Plate, is also pushing in, also diving beneath central Japan, but along different lines. It descends along the Sagami Trough to the southeast, and along the Suruga and Nankai Trough system to the south and southwest. These are not minor features. The Nankai system is one of the most feared sources of great earthquakes in all of Japanese history, a machine that has produced devastating megathrust quakes again and again across the centuries. So already, before we have even reached the volcano, we have 2 enormous subduction systems, 2 separate plates sinking beneath the country from 2 different directions, and here is where the knot gets truly tangled. Riding on the front edge of that Philippine Sea Plate, being shoved up into Honshu from the south, is a chain of volcanic islands and undersea mountains called the Izu and Bonin Arc. This arc is too buoyant to slide down easily, so instead of subducting cleanly it jams itself into the body of Japan, a process geologists call the Izu Collision Zone. Picture it. The Pacific Plate sinking from the east, the Philippine Sea Plate sinking from the south, and riding that southern plate, a thick, stubborn arc of volcanic crust ramming directly into the underside of central Honshu, refusing to go quietly. 3 great pieces of the Earth's shell, all converging on one region, all at once. There is a reason geologists single this out as one of the only places of its kind anywhere on the planet, and it comes down to a rare meeting of boundaries. Most of the world's plate boundaries are lonely things, one type of motion stretched along a line, a subduction zone here, a transform fault there, a spreading ridge somewhere else. It is genuinely unusual for 2 major subduction systems to converge on a single region, and it is rarer still for a buoyant volcanic arc to be jamming into the same spot at the same time. Yet that is exactly what happens at the foot of Fuji. The convergence of the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, and the colliding Izu Arc creates a junction so concentrated that the forces do not simply add together, they tangle, producing a stress field of a complexity that few other inhabited places on Earth can match. When scientists call this one of the most complicated tectonic settings in the world, they are not reaching for drama. They are describing a measurable structural fact about how many large forces are crowded into how small a space. And that crowding has a consequence that matters for tonight. In a simple boundary, the crust tends to fail in predictable ways, along known faults, with known kinds of motion. In a tangled junction like this, the failure can come in many forms, at many depths, on many different fractures, because the rock is being loaded from several directions at once, and can give way wherever the strain happens to peak first. That is why this single region produces earthquakes of so many different characters, far down and shallow, on this fault and on that one, in a way that can seem almost chaotic from the outside. It is not chaos. It is the signature of a place where the planet's machinery is doubled and tripled up, and it is the ground on which a volcano was somehow able to grow. That region, the place where these forces all meet and fight for the same space, is the foot of Mount Fuji. Hold that thread, because this is the core of everything. The earthquake tonight did not happen in some random patch of crust. It happened at the precise junction where the largest plate on Earth, a second major plate, and a colliding volcanic arc are all crowded together, grinding, locking, and releasing. When you ask what could cause a quake at the base of Fuji, the honest answer is, what here could not? The whole place is a machine built to make the ground move. Let me slow down on just how strange and violent this arrangement is, because we throw around words like subduction and collision so casually that they stop meaning anything. Subduction is not a gentle process. It is one slab of the planet's outer shell, a slab dozens of kilometers thick and thousands of kilometers wide, being forced down and under another, bending as it goes, scraping, sticking, and then suddenly tearing free in the ruptures we call great earthquakes. The Pacific Plate doing this along the Japan Trench is the single most productive earthquake machine on the planet, and it runs in a line just off Japan's eastern coast. By itself, that one boundary would be enough to make Japan one of the shakiest countries on Earth. But Japan does not get just that one. It gets a second great slab arriving from the south, and a stubborn volcanic arc ramming in on top of it, all converging on the same corner of the country. And here is the geometry that makes the foot of Fuji unique. The reason it earns the word knot rather than just boundary. At most plate boundaries, the forces run in one clear direction. 2 plates pull apart or slide past, or one dives under the other, and the stress has a single orientation you can draw with one arrow. At Fuji, you cannot draw it with one arrow. The Pacific Plate pushes from the east, the Philippine Sea Plate pushes from the south, the Izu Arc jams upward from beneath. The crust caught in the middle is not simply being shoved one way, it is being squeezed from several directions at once, twisted, folded, and stacked, like a knot of rope pulled tight from 3 ends simultaneously. A structure under that kind of multi-directional load develops fractures running in every orientation, which is exactly why this region is webbed with so many faults. The ground here is not stressed along a line, it is stressed in a tangle, and a tangle has 1,000 places where it can suddenly give. This is why I keep calling it the most dangerous tectonic knot on the planet, and I do not use those words lightly. Most earthquake zones are a conversation between 2 plates. This is an argument between 3, conducted at depth, under a mountain, with the stakes measured in the lives of one of the most densely populated regions in the world. The faults here are numerous. The stress paths are complicated. The pressure comes from multiple directions at the same time, so the crust is not just being pushed, it is being twisted, squeezed, and stacked all at once. and a knot under that kind of strain does not need much of an excuse to slip. So when the ground moved tonight, in a sense the only surprising thing would have been if it never moved at all. But understanding that the knot exists is only half the picture. The other half is the question that should be making the hair on your neck stand up. If this is the meeting point of three colliding plates, why is there a volcano sitting right on top of it? The answer to that question is the reason a tectonic earthquake here can never be completely separated from the mountain above it. Let us climb back up, from the plates to the magma. Part 5. How a giant grew on top of the knot. Mount Fuji is not just a beautiful mountain that happens to be near an earthquake zone. The mountain and the knot are the same story. Fuji exists because of the collision. It grew directly above the place where these plates converge, and its magma, the molten rock that gives it the power to erupt, is plumbed into the very subduction that makes this region shake. You cannot fully separate the volcano from the tectonics, and that single fact is why a quake at its base is never quite as simple as we would like it to be. Let me explain how subduction builds a volcano, because once you understand the mechanism, the danger underneath Fuji makes a different kind of sense. When a plate dives down beneath another and sinks toward the hot interior of the Earth, it carries water and other volatile material down with it, locked into the minerals of the descending slab. As that slab goes down and heats up, it releases that water into the rock above it. And here is the strange part. Adding water to hot rock does not cool it down. It lowers the melting point. The water acts like a flux, and the rock above the sinking plate begins to melt. That newly molten rock is lighter than the solid material around it, so it rises, gathering into chambers, working its way upward, until over thousands of years it builds a mountain of erupted material on the surface. That mountain is a volcano. That is the recipe, and Japan's volcanoes, Fuji included, are cooked by exactly this process. Now apply that to our knot. Beneath Mount Fuji, the magma is linked to the sinking of the Pacific Plate and to the complicated splitting and sinking of the Philippine Sea Plate. The same machine that generates the earthquakes is the machine that feeds the volcano. They are not neighbours who happen to live on the same street. They are powered by the same engine, drawing from the same descending slabs, sharing the same tortured section of the Earth's crust. When you grasp that, you understand why scientists cannot simply look at a quake here and say, that is a rock problem. The magma is a separate matter entirely. Down there, the rock and the magma are part of one continuous system. This is the thread tightening again. The reason a 5.6 at the foot of Fuji gets the whole world's attention is precisely this coupling. If the volcano were an unrelated feature, a mountain that just happened to be built over a fault, a tectonic quake nearby would be reassuringly irrelevant. But it is not unrelated. It is the surface expression of the same forces that just moved the ground. So the quake and the magma are, at minimum, distant relatives living in the same house, and when one of them stirs in the night, you would be foolish not to at least check on the other. Let me sit with the timescales for a moment, because they are the antidote to panic and most people never hear them. A volcano like Fuji does not run on human time. Its magma system gathers and shifts over centuries and millennia, not over hours and days. The molten rock beneath it accumulates slowly, cools and crystallizes slowly, pressurizes slowly. When we say the volcano is plumbed into the subduction machine, we are describing a relationship that plays out across spans of time so long that a single night, a single earthquake, is barely a flicker within it. So when an earthquake near Fuji happens in an instant and the magma system has been doing its patient work for thousands of years, the idea that the one instantly reshapes the other is, on its face, unlikely. The quake is fast. The magma is slow. They live in different tempos even though they share the same house. But slow does not mean disconnected, and this is the subtlety that the loud voices always flatten. Over very long spans, large changes in tectonic stress genuinely can influence a volcanic system. The pressure that builds and releases across the knot, the way the crust is loaded and unloaded by great earthquakes, is part of the long environment in which the magma sits. So the honest picture is not the magma is a sealed box that the earthquakes never touch, and it is also not every quake pokes the magma. The honest picture is that the two are coupled across long time scales, intimately related but slow to respond to one another, like two parts of one enormous patient system. A single moderate quake does not lurch that system forward. But the existence of the coupling is the reason we never get to fully ignore a quake here, because the relationship, however slow, is real. Hold that nuance, because almost everyone you will hear talking about this either denies the coupling entirely or wildly exaggerates it, and the truth as usual lives in the more careful middle. I want to be careful and fair here, because this is exactly the kind of connection that gets twisted into something it is not. The coupling between Fuji's magma and the region's tectonics does not mean a quake automatically pokes the magma awake. It does not mean that every time the ground shakes, the volcano edges closer to erupting. The system is far more sluggish and more complicated than that. Magma chambers are not balloons waiting for a pin. They are slow, pressurized, patient things. A single moderate earthquake is, in the grand scale of that system, a small event. So the correct statement is not the magma is rising. The correct statement is the magma and the quake share a home, and that is reason enough to watch, but not reason to panic. Let me give you an image that captures the relationship honestly, because the right picture is worth more than 100 careful sentences. Think of the magma system beneath Fuji as an enormous, slow furnace, buried under the mountain, fed by the descending plates, gathering its heat across thousands of years. And think of the earthquakes as the building settling around that furnace, the structure of the crust shifting and creaking under the same forces that keep the furnace fed. The settling of the building does not stoke the furnace does not cause every creak, but they are in the same house, built on the same foundation, subject to the same loads. When the building creaks loudly in the night, no one sensible runs to the furnace expecting it to roar. But no one sensible ignores the creak entirely either, because the building and the furnace are not strangers. They are parts of one structure, and a wise caretaker keeps an eye on both. That is the relationship between Fuji's quakes and Fuji's magma, and it is why the only intelligent posture is the watchful middle. What that image rules out is the lazy thinking on both sides. It rules out the alarmist who hears the creak and screams that the furnace is about to explode, because the creak and the furnace operate on completely different timescales, and the creak carries no such message. And it rules out the dismisser who insists the furnace and the building have nothing to do with each other, because they plainly share a foundation and a set of forces. The truth is less satisfying than either extreme and far more accurate. The quake tonight was the building settling. The furnace is doing what it has done for centuries slowly, patiently on its own clock, and the caretakers are watching both, exactly as they should, neither panicking at the creak nor pretending it never happened. Still, sharing a home means the question can never be fully dismissed, and that is the genuine tension at the centre of tonight. We have a sleeping volcano, plumbed into a colliding three-plate knot, that just felt a shallow earthquake almost directly at its base. Nothing about that says eruption, but nothing about it lets us look away either, and to understand what might actually have moved tonight, we need to look at the specific scars in the crust around the mountain, the faults that thread through this region like cracks through stressed glass, because one of them most likely is what slipped. Let us find out which. Part 6. The Scars Around the Mountain. When the ground breaks in an earthquake, it usually breaks along a fault, a pre-existing fracture in the crust where two blocks of rock can slide against each other. Around Mount Fuji, there is no shortage of candidates, and that itself tells you something about this place. A region with one fault is a region under one kind of stress. A region webbed with many faults running in many directions is a region being pulled and pushed from several sides at once. The crust around Fuji is the second kind. It is scarred, fractured, and crisscrossed, exactly what you would expect from a spot caught in the grip of three colliding plates. Let me walk you around the mountain and name the scars, because each one is a clue. On the western side of Fuji runs a major fault system, the Fujikawa-Kako Fault Zone, a feature that has long worried Japanese seismologists because it connects upward into the same Great Suruga and Nankai Trough system we talked about earlier. To the southeast lies the Sagami Trough, the boundary along which the Philippine Sea Plate dives down, and the source of some of the most destructive earthquakes ever to strike the Tokyo region. To the south and southwest sits the broader Suruga and Nankai system, and from the south, pressing relentlessly, comes the Izu Collision Zone, the volcanic arc jamming into Honshu. Four major sources of stress surrounding one mountain from four different directions. So which one moved tonight? Here is where I have to be honest with you about the limits of what we know in the first hours after an event like this. As of the earliest public records, there is no confirmed named surface fault being pointed to as the source. That is not unusual. It takes time and careful analysis to match a quake to a specific fracture, and sometimes the rupture happens on a fault that was not even mapped before it slipped. The most accurate thing we can say tonight is that this was a local tectonic earthquake inside the complicated central Honshu collision zone. It was the crust adjusting under the multi-directional pressure of that knot. It was almost certainly not the magma forcing the ground apart. Let me say a little more about each of these scars, because their histories are part of why the experts take this region so seriously. The Sagami Trough to the southeast is not an abstract line on a map. It is the source region of some of the most destructive earthquakes ever to strike the area around the capital, the kind of great quake that has, in the historical record, reshaped the region and taken enormous numbers of lives. The Suruga and Nankai system, to the south and southwest, is the home of recurring megathrust earthquakes that Japanese scientists track with intense concern, because the historical pattern suggests the system produces giant events on a schedule measured in centuries, and the clock is always running. And the Fujikawa-Kako fault zone on the western flank is watched precisely because it may be linked to that same Great Suruga and Nankai machine, a possible bridge between the volcano's doorstep and one of the most feared earthquake sources in the country. These are not minor cracks. They are some of the most significant fault systems in all of Japan, and they all crowd around this single mountain. So when a quake strikes here and we cannot immediately name which scar moved, the uncertainty is not trivial, because the candidates range from ordinary local faults to strands connected to systems capable of the very largest earthquakes. That is part of why the first analysis matters so much, and why scientists work carefully rather than rushing to label it. The good news, the reassuring news, is that the character of tonight's event, its modest size and its tectonic fingerprint, does not point to one of the great systems unzipping. It points to a local adjustment within the tangle, the ordinary kind of slip that this fractured crust produces regularly. But the very fact that we have to check, that we have to rule out the larger possibilities, tells you everything about the company this mountain keeps underground. Let me underline that last point, because it matters and it is easy to lose in the drama. The character of this earthquake, a shallow but ordinary tectonic rupture, is the signature of rock slipping against rock under tectonic strain. It is not the signature of magma punching its way toward the surface, which tends to announce itself with a very different kind of seismic fingerprint, swarms of small low-frequency events that trace the movement of fluid through cracks. We did not see that. We saw a tectonic quake. The distinction is the entire difference between watch this carefully and run for the hills, and right now we are firmly, reassuringly in the first category. Let me linger on why we cannot always name the fault immediately, because it reveals something important about this place. In a simple, well-studied fault zone, when a quake hits, seismologists can often point to the responsible fracture within hours, because they already have it mapped and they know its behavior. But the crust around Fuji is so fractured, so crisscrossed by faults of many sizes and orientations, that matching a single rupture to a single named fault takes painstaking analysis, and sometimes the answer turns out to be a fault that was never on any map at all. Hidden faults, buried under sediment or simply too small to have been charted, can and do produce earthquakes, and a region this tangled is exactly where you would expect to find them. So the honest statement tonight is not we know which fault moved. It is the crust adjusted somewhere inside this tangle, and it will take time to learn precisely where. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is an accurate reflection of how genuinely complicated this knot is. And let me strengthen the most reassuring point in this whole section, the fingerprint, because it is the single best reason to stay calm tonight. Earthquakes leave a signature on the instruments, and those signatures come in different flavors. A tectonic quake, rock breaking against rock, produces a sharp, sudden, high-frequency jolt, the seismic equivalent of a stick snapping. The movement of magma and gas through the crust produces something else entirely, a longer, lower, more drawn-out signal, the seismic equivalent of a slow gurgle through a pipe, and often it comes in swarms, many small events strung together as fluid works its way through fractures. These two fingerprints look different on a seismograph, and trained eyes can tell them apart quickly. Tonight, what the instruments recorded near Fuji was the snap, the brittle tectonic signature, not the gurgle of moving fluid. That single fact is worth more reassurance than any number of soothing words, because it is the direct physical evidence that what moved tonight was rock under strain, not magma on the rise. But come back to the thread, because the thread is what keeps this from being just a geology lecture. The reason all of these named faults matter, the reason we bother to list them, is that they are the strands of the knot. Each one is a place where the strain of those three colliding plates can release, and tonight, one of them, mapped or not, released. The mountain stood over it all, silent, 300 years and counting since it last spoke, while the crust beneath its feet shifted on one of its many scars. That image, the calm giant above and the fractured, straining rock below, is the truest picture of this place I can give you, and it raises the question that takes us out of the geology and into the human story. The question that put Tokyo on edge in the afternoon and Yamanashi on edge at night. If the knot can move under Fuji, it can move under the capital too, because the same stacked plates that run beneath the mountain run beneath one of the largest cities on Earth. And earlier that same day, hours before the mountain shook, they had already moved once. To understand why the whole nation was uneasy, we have to go back to that first quake, the one under Tokyo. Let us rewind to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Part 7. The Quake Beneath the Capital. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, hours before the mountain shook, the first earthquake of the day struck, and it struck close to the beating centre of the country. The magnitude was 5.8, slightly larger than the Fuji event that would come that night. The epicentre sat in northeastern Chiba Prefecture, east of Tokyo, on the Pacific side of Honshu. And because Chiba wraps right up against the capital, this quake was felt by an enormous number of people. Across Tokyo, buildings swayed. Tall towers moved the way they are engineered to move, flexing rather than breaking, but for the millions of people inside them, that slow, sickening sway is its own kind of terror. Now here is the detail that makes this first quake different from the second, and it is a detail that goes right to the structure of the knot. This Chiba earthquake was not shallow. It happened far down, at a depth of roughly 50 kilometres, about 31 miles below the surface. That is much further down than the recent shallow quakes that have been rattling the region, and that depth tells us something profound about where it happened. A rupture 50 kilometres down beneath Tokyo is not a crack opening in the surface soil under the city. It is a slip far down inside the stacked plate system, down in the layered pile-up where the Pacific plate and the Philippine Sea plate and the overriding crust are all jammed together, one beneath the other. Let me make sure that lands, because it is the bridge between the two quakes. Underneath the Kanto region, the area that includes Tokyo, the plates are not arranged in a simple two-layer sandwich. They are stacked in a way that geologists sometimes describe as one of the most complicated plate arrangements anywhere a major city has ever been built. The Philippine Sea plate wedges in at one level. The Pacific plate sinks beneath that at a still lower level. The result is that earthquakes under Tokyo can happen at many different depths, depending on which layer of the stack slips. A shallow quake, a mid-level quake, a far-down quake like this one, each comes from a different floor of the same buried structure. So the Chiba earthquake was the stacked plates beneath the capital releasing strain at depth, and because it was far down, the energy spread out and was felt across a wide area, which is exactly why so much of Tokyo felt that swaying. The shaking reached intensity 4 on the Japanese scale across parts of the region, strong enough that no one slept through it, strong enough to send that familiar jolt of dread through a city that has been waiting, for a very long time, for the big one it knows is eventually coming. There was no tsunami warning, which is appropriate for a far-down inland-type rupture like this. There was no major damage because Japan builds for exactly this. But there was fear, and the fear was rational. Let me dwell on the stacked plates beneath Tokyo, because it is one of the most remarkable and unsettling facts in all of Earth science, and most residents of the city go their whole lives without fully picturing it. Greater Tokyo is home to tens of millions of people, one of the largest concentrations of human beings anywhere on the planet, and it is built directly on top of a place where the crust is layered in a way that few major cities can match. The Philippine Sea plate wedges in beneath the region at one level. Below that, the Pacific plate sinks at a steeper angle. The overriding crust sits on top, 3 layers, stacked, each one capable of generating its own earthquakes at its own depth. It means that the ground beneath Tokyo is not a single floor, but a multi-story structure of moving rock, and a quake can come from the upper floor, the middle, or the basement, each feeling different at the surface. That is why the depth of this Chiba quake is not a dry technical detail, but a clue to which floor of the structure spoke. A rupture at 50 kilometers down is firmly in the lower part of that stack, well within the wedged and sinking slabs rather than in the shallow crust where the city's foundations sit. And because it released its energy from so far down, the shaking spread across a wide area rather than concentrating savagely in one small zone, which is precisely why so much of the metropolis felt that long, queasy sway at once. The same event, if it had happened at a fraction of that depth directly under the city centre, would have been a very different and far more dangerous story. The depth, in this case, was a mercy. Tokyo has long lived under the knowledge that a major shallow quake directly beneath it is one of the great looming threats of its existence, the event its engineers and planners have spent generations preparing for. This was not that, but it was a reminder, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, that the floors beneath the city are never truly still. Hold the thread. 2 quakes, 1 day, 1 not. The afternoon quake under Tokyo and the night quake under Fuji were not the same earthquake, and as far as we can tell they were not simple cause and effect, one triggering the other. But they are siblings. They are 2 different expressions of the same overarching reality, the reality that central Japan sits on a stack of colliding plates under relentless strain. One sibling spoke from far down beneath the capital, the other spoke from close to the surface beneath the volcano. Different floors of the same groaning building. And that is what made this day feel different, even to people who live with earthquakes as a fact of life. It was not one shock to absorb and move past. It was the not announcing itself twice, from 2 directions, bracketing a single day. When the capital shakes in the afternoon and the sacred mountain shakes at night, it is very hard not to feel that the whole system is restless. So the natural next question is whether these 2 events really are connected, whether the day's pattern means anything, or whether the human mind is just doing what it always does, drawing a line between 2 dots that happen to sit near each other. Let us take that question seriously, because the answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. Part 8. 2 depths, 1 machine. Were the 2 quakes connected? This is the question everyone asks after a day like this, and it deserves a careful answer rather than a dramatic one. The strictly cautious response from seismology is that we should not assume a direct trigger between 2 earthquakes just because they happened on the same day in the same broad region. Earthquakes happen in Japan constantly. 2 in 1 day, even 2 notable ones, can absolutely be coincidence in the narrow sense that one did not reach out and cause the other. So if you are looking for me to say the Tokyo quake set off the Fuji quake, I'm not going to say that, because the evidence does not support that specific claim. But there is a deeper kind of connection that is absolutely real, and it is the one that matters. Both quakes are products of the same machine. The afternoon rupture far below Chiba and the night rupture near the surface under Fuji are both the central Honshu plate stack releasing strain. They are bound together not by one quake nudging the other, but by their shared origin in the relentless convergence of those 3 plates. Picture a single sheet of metal being slowly bent in a press. Cracks may form at one corner and then at another corner hours apart in different spots at different depths. They are not causing each other. They are both being caused by the same enormous force bending the same sheet. That is what we watched in central Japan that day. This is why I keep insisting on the thread that it is the knot, not the individual quake. That is the real subject. If you fixate on either earthquake alone, you miss the picture. The 5.8 under Tokyo, taken by itself, is a moderate far-down quake, unremarkable. The 5.6 under Fuji, taken by itself, is a moderate shallow quake, also unremarkable. But put them together, recognize that they came from different floors of the same buried structure on the same day, and you start to see the thing that actually deserves your attention, which is the structure itself. The structure is under load. The structure is active, and the structure happens to have a sleeping volcano sitting on its most complicated corner. There is a phrase that captures it. Japan does not sit on a fault. Japan sits on a disaster waiting in slow motion, a stack of moving plates that interact at depth and can let go at many different levels. That is not me being dramatic for the sake of it. That is the structural reality, and it is precisely why a country can experience a far-down quake under its capital and a shallow quake under its most famous mountain within the same 12 hours, and have both make complete geological sense. The machine is large enough and complicated enough to do both at once, without any spooky coordination required. There is a real science to how one earthquake can influence another, and it is worth understanding so you can see exactly where the legitimate caution ends and the overreach begins. When a fault slips, it does not just release stress, it also redistributes it, loading some neighbouring faults a little more and relieving others. Scientists track this through what they call stress transfer, and it comes in two forms. There is the permanent static change in the stress field around the rupture, and there is the temporary dynamic stress carried by the seismic waves themselves as they roll outward. Both are real, both are measurable, and both can, in principle, nudge a fault that was already close to failure into slipping a little sooner than it otherwise would have. This is the genuine, evidence-based version of the idea that earthquakes can be connected. But notice how far that is from the dramatic version, and notice the scale problem. For one quake to meaningfully load another, the first quake usually has to be large, and the second fault usually has to be already near its breaking point and reasonably close by. The afternoon Chiba quake and the night Fuji quake were both moderate, separated by a considerable distance and by very different depths within the stack. The cautious scientific read is that we should not casually assume a direct trigger between them, and I am going to honour that read rather than overstate it. So when I say the two are connected, I do not mean one pulled the trigger on the other, I mean they are both being driven by the same enormous, slow force bending the same towering structure, the way two cracks can appear at different corners of a sheet of metal in a press, hours apart, neither causing the other, both caused by the press. That is the honest shape of the connection, and it is connection enough to matter, without tipping into a story the data does not support. And once you see the day this way, as two windows into one straining machine, the unease that swept across Japan stops looking like superstition and starts looking like pattern recognition. People felt that something larger was being expressed, and in a real sense they were right. Not in the sense that a catastrophe is imminent, but in the sense that the underlying system, the knot, was visibly audibly active. When a structure under load creaks twice in one day from two different corners, you do not necessarily run out of the building, but you do start listening more carefully to the walls. So we have established the machine, and we have established that both of the day's quakes came from it. But there is one more reason, beyond the plates and beyond the stack, that a quake at the foot of Fuji specifically sends a chill down the spine of anyone who knows the history. Because this exact mountain, this exact silent giant, has a documented record of being stirred by the very forces we have been describing. And the last time it woke up, it did so in the shadow of a great earthquake. To understand the full weight of tonight, we have to travel back more than 300 years to the winter of 1707. Let me tell you what happened then. Part 9. The Ghost of 1707. Mount Fuji has not erupted in more than 300 years. To most people, that silence reads as safety. The mountain is calm. It has been calm for centuries. It is practically a symbol of serenity. But to a geologist, 300 years of silence is not necessarily comfort. It can simply mean that pressure has had 300 years to build. And the last time Fuji broke its silence, the way it did so is the reason every strong quake near its base now gets a second, harder look. That last eruption happened in the winter of 1707, and it is known as the Hoei eruption. Here is the detail that should make you sit up, the detail that haunts this entire subject. The Hoei eruption of Fuji did not happen in isolation. It began just 49 days after one of the largest earthquakes in Japanese recorded history, the Great Hoei Earthquake, a colossal megathrust event along the same Nankai and Suruga trough system we have been talking about all night. A great earthquake struck the subduction zone, and 49 days later, the mountain that sits on that same tortured knot tore open and erupted. 49 days, less than 2 months between the earth heaving and the volcano answering. Now, I have to be extremely careful here, because this is exactly the kind of fact that gets ripped out of context and turned into something it is not. So let me say it as plainly as I can. The earthquake that preceded the Hoei eruption was a giant. It was up in the high magnitude 8 range, a megathrust monster, one of the most powerful earthquakes Japan has ever experienced. The quake we felt at the foot of Fuji tonight was a 5.6. The difference between those two is not small. It is not even large. It is astronomical. Because the energy released by an earthquake grows so steeply with magnitude, a high magnitude 8 quake releases something on the order of tens of thousands of times more energy than a 5.6. They are not in the same category. They are barely in the same universe. So let me be absolutely clear, because I will not let this video become fuel for a panic that the data does not support. tonight's 5.6 is nowhere near the scale of the earthquake that preceded the 1707 eruption. The existence of the Hohe precedent does not mean tonight's quake will trigger an eruption. It does not mean the mountain is 49 days from waking. A moderate tectonic quake and a megathrust monster are completely different events, and only one of them is in the historical record as a possible eruption trigger. Anyone telling you that tonight's quake means Fuji is about to blow is either misinformed or selling something. Set that aside firmly. But, and you knew there was a but, the Hohe story still matters, and here is why it connects back to our thread. The reason scientists watch Fuji so closely, the reason a moderate quake at its base makes headlines, is precisely because history shows that this mountain responds to very large tectonic stress changes. The volcano is demonstrably coupled to the seismic machine beneath it. We have a documented case of the knot moving in a big way, and the mountain answering shortly after. That does not make a small quake dangerous. What it does is confirm that the relationship between earthquakes and this particular volcano is not theoretical. It is written into the historical record in ash and fire. So when the ground moves here, even modestly, the appropriate response is not fear, but it is also not indifference. It is to watch the mountain the way you would watch a sleeping animal that you know, for a fact, can wake. Let me put real numbers on why a magnitude 5.6 and a high magnitude 8 are not just different sizes but different worlds, because this is where the panic merchants count on you not doing the math. The magnitude scale is not linear. Each step up the scale represents roughly a 32-fold increase in the energy released. So going from a 5.6 to a 6.6 is about 32 times more energy. Going up another full step to a 7.6 is about 1,000 times more. And going all the way up into the high magnitude 8 range, where the Great Hohe earthquake lived, means something on the order of tens of thousands of times more energy than tonight's quake released. Try to hold that ratio in your head. If tonight's quake were a single match struck in the dark, the earthquake that preceded the 1707 eruption was closer to a wildfire consuming a forest. To put them in the same sentence as comparable triggers is not just wrong, it is a category error. So why does the Hohe story still earn a place in tonight's video if the scale is that mismatched? Because it establishes the one thing that the doubters and the dismissers get wrong in the other direction. It proves the relationship is real. There exists, in the documented historical record, a case where the knot moved in a truly enormous way and the mountain answered within 49 days. That is not folklore. That is history. It tells us that Fuji is a volcano that can respond to extreme tectonic stress, that the coupling we discussed earlier is not a theoretical abstraction, but something that has actually played out in fire and ash. And once you know that the relationship is genuine at the extreme end, you understand why even a modest quake at the foot of the mountain is worth watching, not because it is a trigger, but because it is a movement of the exact system that, under vastly larger stress, has produced an eruption before. The Hohe precedent does not make tonight dangerous. It makes tonight worth paying attention to, which is a very different and much more honest claim. And there is one more piece of the Hohe story that gives it teeth for the modern world. A piece that explains why this is not just an academic concern for the villagers on the mountain slopes. When Fuji erupted in 1707, it did not keep its fury local. It threw ash across the region, and the wind carried that ash toward Edo, the city we now call Tokyo. That detail transforms the stakes entirely, because it means a future eruption of Fuji is not just a problem for the people in its shadow, it is potentially a problem for one of the largest urban regions on the planet. So before we move on, we need to sit with what a Fuji eruption could actually mean today, not to frighten you, but because you cannot understand why the world watches this mountain until you understand what is downwind. Let us follow the ash. Part 10. What is downwind? Imagine the 1707 eruption happening again, today, with the same winds carrying ash in the same direction. The mountain that was downwind in the 18th century is downwind of one of the most concentrated populations and one of the most complex pieces of infrastructure ever assembled by human beings. A similar eruption now would not just bury the villages around the lakes, though it would certainly threaten them. It could disrupt major transport routes, the highways and rail lines that knit central Japan together. It could close airports, because volcanic ash and jet engines are a deadly combination that grounds aircraft instantly. It could foul power systems and water supplies, and depending on the wind, it could drop ash on Tokyo itself, a metropolitan region of tens of millions of people. Volcanic ash is not soft and fluffy like the ash from a campfire, and this is a point people consistently underestimate. It is pulverized rock and glass, abrasive and heavy, especially when it gets wet. A thick fall of it can collapse roofs under its weight. It can clog the air intakes of machinery and vehicles. It can short out electrical equipment. It can make roads treacherous and runways unusable. It can turn breathing into a hazard for the vulnerable. A major ash fall over a city the size of Tokyo would not be a picturesque dusting. It would be a slow, grinding, systemic crisis affecting transport, power, health, and supply chains for a region that drives a significant slice of the entire world's economy. That is what is downwind of Mount Fuji. Japan has actually studied this scenario in detail, which tells you how seriously it is taken, and the findings are sobering. Planners have modelled what a major Fuji eruption would do to the modern region, tracing how ash would spread under typical winds, estimating how quickly transport would seize up, how power and water might fail, how long recovery could take, and how many people and how much economic activity would be affected. These are not fringe exercises. They are the prudent work of a society that knows it lives beneath a loaded mountain and refuses to be caught unprepared. The very existence of such planning is a measure of the stakes. You do not build detailed contingency models for a threat you consider trivial. You build them for a threat you respect, one whose consequences, however unlikely in any given year, would be large enough to demand readiness. And yet, and this is the balance I keep insisting on, the existence of those plans is not a sign that an eruption is near. It is a sign that a serious society prepares for serious possibilities long before they arrive, the same way a city builds flood defences in the calm years between floods. The plans sit on the shelf, updated and ready, precisely so that they are there if they are ever needed, not because anyone expects to need them tomorrow. So when you hear that Japan has elaborate preparations for a Fuji eruption, do not read that as evidence that the mountain is stirring. Read it as evidence of exactly the calm, long-range, clear-eyed seriousness that this knot deserves, and, for the most part, receives. That seriousness is the appropriate response to the stakes, and it is the opposite of panic. This is why the stakes around this mountain are so wildly out of proportion to a single moderate earthquake, and why I keep pulling us back to the thread. The reason a 5.6 at the foot of Fuji is a global headline, while a 5.6 in the open ocean is a footnote, is this asymmetry of consequence. The quake itself was minor. What sits above the spot it shook is anything but. The mountain is a loaded structure, 300 years into its silence, plumbed into a colliding plate knot standing upwind of one of humanity's great cities. When you hold all of that in your mind at once, you understand that the world is not overreacting when it flinches at a quake here. It is responding correctly to the size of what is at stake, not the size of the quake. Let me make the ashfall scenario concrete, because the word ash lulls people into imagining something soft, and the reality is the opposite. When Fuji erupted in 1707, it did not produce lava flows pouring down its slopes. It produced an explosive eruption that hurled enormous quantities of fragmented rock and glass into the sky, and the wind carried that material east, dropping it across the region and onto the city that would become Tokyo. Contemporary accounts describe ash falling on Edo, darkening the sky, coating the ground, fouling the air. Farmland was buried and ruined for years, and that was in a pre-industrial world, a world without electrical grids, without airports, without water treatment plants, without the dense interlocking infrastructure that a modern megacity depends on for every hour of its survival. Now drop that same eruption onto the central Japan of today and trace the cascade. Ash infiltrates and shorts electrical systems, threatening the power that everything else depends on. It clogs water intakes and contaminates supplies. It grounds aircraft completely, because even a thin cloud of volcanic ash can destroy jet engines in flight, which means airports close and an entire region's air links vanish at once. It coats roads and rail lines, making transport treacherous or impossible, choking the movement of food, fuel and people. Wet ash grows heavy enough to threaten roofs, and all of this would fall not on a quiet agrarian countryside, but on one of the densest, most economically vital urban regions on the planet, a place whose smooth functioning matters to the entire global economy. That is why a future Fuji eruption is studied not as a local hazard, but as a potential national and even international crisis. The mountain is beautiful, and it is upwind of one of humanity's great nerve centres. And yet, I have to bring us back to ground, because the responsible read of tonight is still calm. Everything we just described is what an eruption could do, not what is happening. The earthquake tonight was tectonic, not volcanic. There is no eruption, no confirmed magma ascent, no raised alert level. The downwind nightmare is a reason to monitor Fuji forever, with the best instruments we have, not a forecast of next week. We hold two truths at once, and holding both is the entire skill of thinking clearly about this place. Truth 1, the stakes here are enormous. Truth 2, tonight's specific event does not move those stakes. Both are real, and you need both to see straight. So if the stakes are that high, and the coupling between quake and magma is real, but tonight's event is reassuringly tectonic, then everything comes down to one question. What happens next? How do the scientists who guard this mountain tell the difference between the knot simply being the knot, the ordinary groaning of a stressed structure, and the first genuine sign that the giant above it is stirring? Because there is a difference, and it shows up in the data if you know what to listen for. There is a checklist, and tonight, that checklist is the most important set of measurements in Japan. Let me walk you through exactly what they are watching. Part 11. The Checklist in the Dark. Right now, in monitoring stations around Mount Fuji, instruments are listening to the mountain in ways the human senses never could, and the people reading those instruments are running through a mental checklist that separates a normal tectonic aftershock sequence from the early signs of volcanic unrest. I want to walk you through that checklist, because it is the most honest possible answer to the question everyone is really asking, which is, should I be worried? The checklist is how the experts decide that for themselves, and once you know it, you can watch the same signals they do. The first question is the simplest. Do the aftershocks die down quickly? After any earthquake, the crust settles with a series of smaller shocks, and normally those shocks taper off, getting fewer and weaker as the days pass. That decay is the reassuring sound of a system returning to rest. If the aftershocks near Fuji fade on the usual schedule, that is a check mark in the good column. The crust slipped, adjusted, and quieted. So the very first thing the monitors want to see is the shaking calming down on its own. As of now, that is the expectation, and it is the most likely outcome by far. Let me add why that first question, whether the aftershocks fade, carries so much weight, because it is more meaningful than it sounds. Aftershocks are the crust finishing a conversation. When a fault slips, it does not resolve all of its stress in a single instant. It leaves the surrounding rock slightly rearranged, and that rock settles into its new arrangement through a series of smaller slips that taper off over hours, days, and sometimes weeks, following a remarkably consistent fading pattern that seismologists have documented across countless earthquakes worldwide. When the aftershocks near Fuji follow that ordinary fading curve, it is a sign that the system is doing exactly what stressed rock is supposed to do after it breaks, settling back towards stability. It is, in a real sense, the sound of the crust calming down. That is why the watchers want to see the aftershocks behaving normally above almost everything else, because normal behavior is the signature of a system returning to rest rather than building towards something more. What would worry them is a departure from that pattern, and this is where the checklist sharpens. If the aftershocks refused to fade on schedule, if they held steady or grew instead of shrinking, that would suggest the system had not finished. That strain was still being actively released or even added. And if their character changed, shifting from the sharp tectonic snaps toward the lower, longer signals of moving fluid, that would suggest something other than rock was now in motion. So the watchers are not just counting how many aftershocks there are. They are tracking the shape of the decay, the rhythm of the fading, the quality of each signal, reading the aftershock sequence the way a doctor reads a slowing, steadying pulse. As of now, that pulse is doing what a healthy one should. It is settling. The second question is about location, and it is more subtle. Does the seismic activity migrate? In a normal aftershock sequence, the small quakes cluster around the original rupture and stay there. But if the activity were to start creeping, moving steadily closer to the summit of the volcano, that would be a very different signal. Magma on the move tends to fracture rock ahead of it as it pushes upward, and that fracturing can show up as a trail of small earthquakes marching toward the surface. So the monitors are not just counting the aftershocks, they are watching where they go. Staying put is good. Marching toward the summit would be the thing that changes the conversation. The third question gets at the actual fingerprint of magma. Are there low-frequency volcanic earthquakes? Ordinary tectonic quakes like the one tonight have a sharp, high-frequency signature, the sound of brittle rock snapping. But the movement of fluid, of magma and gas through cracks, produces a different kind of seismic signal, a deeper, longer, lower-frequency hum. Seismologists can tell these apart on their instruments. A rise in low-frequency volcanic earthquakes would suggest fluid is moving down there. Tonight, what we saw was the tectonic signature, the brittle snap, not the fluid hum. That is a crucial reassurance, and it is one of the strongest reasons to stay calm. The fourth and fifth questions move beyond earthquakes entirely, into the body of the mountain itself. Is the ground deforming? Volcanoes about to erupt often swell, inflating measurably as magma accumulates beneath them, and modern instruments and satellites can detect even tiny changes in the shape of the surface. If Fuji were to start bulging, that would be a serious signal, and alongside that is the volcanic gas changing. As magma rises, it releases gases, and shifts in the amount or chemistry of those gases can betray its movement long before anything reaches the surface. So the monitors watch the shape of the mountain, and they sample its breath, looking for any sign that something below is changing. And the final item on the checklist is the one that would speak loudest of all. Will the Japan Meteorological Agency raise the alert level? That agency is responsible for watching Fuji, and an official change in its volcanic alert level would be the formal signal that the experts, with all their instruments, have seen enough to upgrade their concern. As of tonight, the alert level has not been raised. None of the escalation signals, not migrating seismicity, not low-frequency quakes, not deformation, not gas anomalies, are being reported. By every item on the checklist that matters, this reads as a tectonic earthquake, not the awakening of a volcano. That is the truth, and it is a calmer truth than the drama of the location might lead you to fear. Let me add some texture to a couple of these checks, because the technology behind them is genuinely remarkable, and it is part of why we can afford to be calm rather than blind. Take ground deformation. Modern monitoring does not rely on someone eyeballing the mountain for changes. It uses networks of precise positioning instruments anchored to the ground, and it uses satellites that bounce radar off the surface from orbit and measure changes in the shape of the land down to fractions of a centimetre. If Fuji were quietly swelling as magma gathered beneath it, even by an amount far too small for any human to see, these systems could catch it. That is an astonishing capability, the ability to watch a mountain breathe from space, and it means that the absence of reported deformation tonight is not a guess or a hope, it is a measurement. The gas monitoring is just as telling. As magma rises within a volcano, it releases dissolved gases, and the mix and volume of those gases change in ways that can betray the movement of molten rock long before it ever nears the surface. Scientists sample the gases emerging from a volcano's vents and fumaroles precisely to read these early chemical tells. A sudden shift in the chemistry can be one of the first signs that something below is changing, and then there is the behavior of the aftershocks themselves, which tend to follow a well-known pattern of decay, fading in number and strength along a predictable curve as the crust settles. When aftershocks follow that ordinary fading pattern, it is the sound of a system returning to rest. It is when they refuse to fade, or when they start to migrate or change character, that the watchers lean in. Tonight, every one of these independent windows, the shape of the ground, the breath of the mountain, the behavior of the aftershocks, the formal alert level, is showing the same reassuring picture. Not one of them is flashing red. But here is why I am not going to simply tell you to relax and forget it, why the thread refuses to let go. The checklist is not a one-time test. It is a vigil. The reason it exists, the reason those instruments run day and night, is that this mountain sits on the knot, and the knot just moved. The right posture is not fear, and it is not dismissal. It is exactly the steady, sustained watching that the scientists are doing right now in the dark around the base of the mountain. And that posture, calm but alert, is the one I want you to carry, because it is the only honest response to a place this powerful. Now, before we close, I have to address the noise, because a story like this always attracts a particular kind of explanation, the kind that sounds thrilling and falls apart the moment you look at it. Let us deal with the conspiracy theories head on. Part 12. The noise around the signal. Whenever the ground moves near something famous, near a landmark, near a sacred mountain, a second tremor follows close behind, and it is not a geological one, It is the wave of theories that insist the earthquake was not natural at all. I want to take these seriously, not because they are correct, but because you deserve a real answer rather than a smug dismissal, and because the truth of what is under Fuji is dramatic enough that it does not need any invention to be worth your attention. So let us go through the claims one at a time, honestly, and see what the data actually supports. The first claim, the one that surfaces almost every time, is that the quake was engineered, that some hidden program or weather weapon or array of antennas reached out and made the ground shake near Fuji on purpose. I understand the instinct behind this. When something frightening happens near something we treasure, the idea that someone did it on purpose can feel less random and therefore less terrifying than the truth. But there is no known technology on Earth capable of triggering a magnitude 5.6 earthquake at a depth of 12 to 20 kilometers inside a subduction and collision zone. The energy involved is staggering, far beyond anything human devices can inject into the crust. And we do not need an exotic cause, because we already have a complete and sufficient one. 3 plates are colliding under this exact spot. That is more than enough to move the ground. When you already have the largest forces on the planet pressing together at a single point, you do not need to invent a secret machine to explain a quake there. The second claim is more emotionally loaded, and it is the idea that authorities know an eruption is imminent and are hiding it, that the calm reassurances are a cover story while the real danger is being concealed. Here is the problem with that theory, and it is a fatal one. The signals that would precede an eruption are not secret. They are publicly tracked and openly published. The seismic data, the deformation measurements, the gas readings, the alert level, all of it is out in the open, monitored by an agency whose entire job is to warn people. A cover-up would require silencing not just one government, but the international scientific community that watches volcanoes worldwide and shares data freely. The claim survives only by treating the absence of alarming signals as proof of a conspiracy, which is a trick, not an argument. When the evidence of danger is missing, the honest conclusion is that the danger is not currently present, not that someone hid the evidence. The third claim is one we encounter often on this channel, the idea that solar activity caused the earthquakes, that a storm on the sun reached across 93 million miles of space and cracked the crust beneath Japan. And I want to be especially fair to this one, because the timing makes it tempting. This was a period of elevated solar activity, with a large and growing sunspot region turning toward Earth, exactly the kind of coincidence that makes a pattern seeker's eyes light up. But coincidence is the key word. There is no established physical mechanism by which geomagnetic activity from the sun triggers the rupture of rock kilometers below the surface. The forces are utterly different in kind and in scale. The plate stresses beneath Japan are, on their own, more than sufficient to produce these quakes, and they would have produced them whether or not the sun was active. A genuinely curious mind notices the coincidence, examines it, and then sets it aside on the evidence. That is not closed-mindedness. That is exactly how you avoid being fooled by the noise. Let me spend an extra moment on the solar claim, because this channel covers the sun constantly, and I owe you the most careful possible treatment of it. It is genuinely true that this was a period of heightened solar activity, with a large and growing sunspot region turning toward our planet, and it is genuinely true that the ground in Japan shook hard during that same stretch. A pattern seeker looks at those two facts side by side and feels the pull of a connection, and I understand that pull because finding hidden links between sky and ground is one of the most seductive moves the human mind can make. But seduction is not evidence, and the honest scientist's job is to ask whether there is any mechanism by which the one could actually cause the other. When you look for that mechanism, you do not find one. The energy that drives a solar storm interacts with our planet's magnetic field and upper atmosphere, far above the surface. The energy that ruptures a fault comes from the slow accumulation of stress in the crust over years and centuries. These are different forms of energy operating on different parts of the planet at wildly different scales, and there is no established physical pathway by which a disturbance in the magnetic field reaches down kilometers into the crust and snaps a fault that was not already at its breaking point. And here is the cleaner test, the one that settles it. The plate stresses beneath Japan are, on their own, more than sufficient to produce these earthquakes. The faults were loaded, the strain was there, the quakes would have happened whether the sun was active or quiet, because the engine that drives them sits beneath Japan, not 93 million miles away. When you already have a complete and sufficient cause sitting right under the epicenter, you do not need to import a second cause from across the solar system. The solar coincidence adds nothing to the explanation except drama. So I treat it the way a careful mind should treat every tempting coincidence. I notice it because noticing is honest. I examine it because examining is the work. And then I set it aside because the evidence gives me no reason to keep it. That is not me closing my mind to a connection. That is me refusing to invent one where the data shows none, which is the only way to stay trustworthy on a channel that talks about the sun as much as this one does. The fourth and final claim is the simplest and, in a way, the most understandable. It is the fear that magma is rising right now, that the quake is the volcano clearing its throat. And the answer here is the checklist we just walked through. A shallow tectonic quake near a volcano is a reason to watch, not a confirmation that magma is on the move. The fingerprint of rising magma, the low-frequency hum, the migrating swarm, the swelling ground, the changing gas, was not present. What we saw was the brittle snap of rock under tectonic strain. So no, the data does not say magma is rising. The data says the crust slipped, and the mountain, for now, sleeps on. I want to say something about why these theories are so seductive, because understanding the appeal is the best defense against it. Every one of these claims offers the same hidden comfort, the comfort of agency. A random earthquake at the foot of a beloved mountain is frightening precisely because no one is in control of it. The planet simply does what it does, indifferent to us, and that indifference is hard to sit with. But if someone engineered the quake, or if authorities are secretly managing a hidden eruption, or if the sun pulled the trigger, then at least there is a hand on the wheel, a cause we can name, a villain we can point at. The conspiracy is, in a strange way, less terrifying than the truth, because it replaces blind chance with intention, and that is exactly why it spreads, and exactly why we have to resist it, because comfort is not the same thing as truth, and a false sense of control is more dangerous than an honest acceptance of uncertainty. There is also a simple test you can apply to any of these claims, and it is the test of falsifiability. Ask yourself, what evidence would convince the person making this claim that they are wrong? For the cover-up theory, the answer is usually nothing, because every reassuring measurement just becomes more proof of the cover-up, and every missing alarm becomes evidence of suppression. A claim that can absorb any possible evidence as confirmation is not a theory at all, it is a closed loop. Real science works the opposite way. The statement this was a tectonic earthquake is falsifiable, because if low-frequency volcanic quakes had appeared, if the ground had begun to swell, if the gases had shifted, the scientists would have said so and changed their conclusion. The willingness to be proven wrong by the data is the difference between a finding and a fantasy. And on this story, the data has had every chance to show magma, and it has shown rock. That is what makes the calm conclusion trustworthy, not the authority of anyone saying it, but the fact that it could have come out the other way and did not. Pull all of that together, and you arrive at the thread one more time. The conspiracy theories all try to make this story more dramatic by adding a hidden hand, a secret weapon, a cover-up, a solar trigger. But the real story does not need any of that, because the real story is already extraordinary. A sleeping giant sitting on the most tangled collision of plates on Earth, plumbed into the same machine that just moved the ground, watched around the clock by people who know its history. That is the truth, and it is more than dramatic enough. The invented explanations are not just wrong, they are a distraction from a reality that is genuinely worth your attention. And that reality, the truth of the knot, is bigger than this single mountain, because what happened at Fuji that day was part of something happening all across Japan at once. Let me widen the lens. Part 13. A country shaking on every front. Step back from Mount Fuji for a moment and look at the whole country, because the two quakes we have been dissecting were not happening in isolation. They were part of a larger pattern playing out across Japan in the same stretch of days, and that wider picture is what truly explains why the nation felt so uneasy. The day before the Fuji and Tokyo quakes, northern Japan had already been struck by a much larger earthquake, near Iwate, revised by Japanese reporting to around magnitude 7.2, with very strong shaking across the Iwate region and beyond. That is not a moderate event. That is a major earthquake, and it had hit the north barely a day earlier. So sequence the days as the people living through them experienced it. First, a powerful magnitude 7+ quake rocks the north. Then, the very next day, a far-down quake rattles the capital in the afternoon, and a shallow quake shakes the foot of the sacred mountain at night. 3 significant earthquakes in 3 different parts of the country across 2 days, each from a different piece of the seismic machine. When you live through that, you do not experience 3 separate news items. You experience a country that suddenly seems to be moving everywhere at once. And that feeling, while frightening, is pointing at something real about how Japan is built. Let me connect these fronts to the knot we have been mapping, because they are all strands of it. In the north and offshore, the Japan Trench has been producing strong earthquakes, the very system where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the country. That is the same engine, remember, that generated the 2011 Tohoku disaster, the magnitude 9 event that sent a tsunami over the coast and remains burned into the memory of everyone who watched it. Under the capital, the far-down Chiba quake showed the stacked plates beneath one of the most populated urban regions on the planet releasing strain far down. And near Fuji, the shallow quake struck the collision and volcanic junction. North, center, and the volcanic knot, 3 different expressions of the same underlying truth. The 2011 Tohoku disaster sits underneath all of this like a shadow, and it is impossible to talk about Japanese seismic anxiety without naming it, because it is the event that recalibrated how an entire nation and the whole world thinks about these forces. On that day, the Japan Trench, the same eastern subduction system we have been describing, ruptured in a magnitude 9 earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded. It shifted the position of the entire country. It generated a tsunami that overtopped seawalls and swept kilometers inland, killing many thousands and triggering a nuclear catastrophe. For everyone who lived through it, and for everyone who watched it unfold on their screens, it permanently destroyed the comfortable illusion that the worst case is unlikely. It proved that the worst case is real, that the machine off Japan's coast is capable of the very largest events the planet can produce. So when the ground shakes hard anywhere in Japan now, that memory is right there, and the fear it leaves behind is not irrational. It is earned. This is the backdrop against which the prior day's magnitude 7.2 near Iwate landed, and it is why that quake, on its own a major event, fed the sense that the whole country was restless. A 7.2 is a serious earthquake by any measure, the kind that in many parts of the world would be the disaster of a decade. In Japan, in the same week as everything else, it became one more front in a pattern. But here I have to apply the same discipline I applied to the 2 quakes near Tokyo and Fuji. A cluster of earthquakes across a seismically active country in a short span of days is not, by itself, proof of an approaching mega-disaster. Earthquakes are not evenly spaced in time. They come in bursts and lulls, and an active stretch can be entirely consistent with the ordinary statistics of a place that sits on a stack of colliding plates. The pattern is real in the sense that it reflects a genuinely loaded system. It is not necessarily a countdown. Holding both of those at once, the reality of the activity and the restraint about what it predicts, is the whole discipline of thinking clearly here. And that truth is the one line I want you to take away from this entire video, the line that ties every part of it together. Japan does not sit on a single fault. It sits on a stack of moving plates that interact at depth, which is exactly why its earthquakes can strike so far down in one place and so shallow in another, so far north on one day and beneath the capital the next. The country is not balanced on one crack in the ground. It is riding on top of a slow-motion collision involving several of the largest moving pieces of the Earth's outer shell, and that collision is always happening, always loading the faults, always feeding the volcanoes. Most days, we do not feel it. On days like these, we feel it everywhere. There is a phrase worth pausing on, the idea that Japan sits on a stack rather than a fault, because it reframes the whole way you should picture the country. When most of us imagine earthquake country, we picture a single great crack, 2 slabs grinding past each other along one line, and we imagine the danger as living along that line. But central Japan is not organized that way. It is a place where slabs of the planet's outer shell are layered over one another, where the boundaries are not one line but several, stacked at different depths and running in different directions. An earthquake can come from the shallow crust, from the wedged plate beneath it, or from the sinking slab beneath that, each a different floor of the same buried structure. This is why the country's earthquakes are so varied in their depth and their location, and why a single region can produce a far-down rupture and a shallow one within the same day. The stack, not the line, is the right mental model, and once you adopt it, the seemingly scattered pattern of these quakes snaps into focus as the behavior of one layered system, and the foot of Fuji is where that stack is most complicated of all, which brings the whole picture together. It is the corner of the country where the layers are most tangled, where the most boundaries crowd into the smallest space, and where, on top of all of it, a volcano sits coupled to the machine below. So when the stack speaks here, it speaks with the most complex voice it has anywhere in Japan, and that is precisely why the experts listen to this corner most attentively of all. The other quakes of these days were the stack speaking from simpler places. The Fuji quake was the stack speaking from its single, most complicated point, with a sleeping giant resting directly on top of the spot that moved. Now, I do not say any of this to leave you frightened, and here the honesty cuts in the reassuring direction. A seismically active stretch of days is not, by itself, a prophecy of catastrophe. Japan has lived inside this machine for its entire existence, and it has become the most earthquake-ready society on Earth precisely because of it. The building codes, the early warning systems, the public drills, the engineering, all of it exists because this country has learned, through centuries of hard experience, how to stand on a stack of colliding plates and survive. When the ground moves there, the response is not chaos. It is a population that knows what to do, structures designed to flex and hold, and instruments that watched it all happen in real time. But the thread pulls us back to Fuji one final time, because among all these fronts the volcanic knot is the one with the extra dimension. The Iwate quake was a major tectonic event, serious but, in the end, an earthquake. The Tokyo quake was the far-down stack releasing strain, frightening but familiar. The Fuji quake was all of that, plus a sleeping giant sitting directly above it, a mountain with a documented history of waking after the earth heaves, standing upwind of one of the world's great cities. That is why, of the three fronts, the one beneath the volcano is the one that earns the longest, hardest stare. Not because tonight changed the forecast, but because of what is stacked up under that single point on the map. And that brings us back at last to the question we started with, the one the seismographs around Fuji are listening for in the dark right now. But before the final question, there is a human truth to sit with, the truth of what it actually means for a whole nation to go on high alert, and why that alert is a sign of strength rather than weakness. Let us talk about what high alert really looks like. Part 14. What high alert really means. When we say a country goes on high alert, the phrase can sound like panic, like sirens and crowds and fear in the streets. But that is not what it looks like in a place like Japan, and the difference is worth understanding, because it changes how you should feel about a night like this one. High alert here does not mean terror. It means readiness. It means a society that has decided through long and painful experience that the correct response to a restless planet is not to look away and hope, but to watch, to prepare, and to build so that when the ground moves, people live. That is a profoundly different thing from fear, and it is the reason Japan absorbs blows that would devastate less ready places. Consider what actually happened during these quakes, the things that did not make headlines because they worked. Tall buildings in Tokyo swayed instead of cracking because they were engineered, at great expense, to flex with the shaking rather than fight it. Early warning systems pushed alerts to phones, giving people precious seconds to brace, to step away from windows, to stop a train before the shaking arrived. Structures around the foot of Fuji, hit by intensity 6, largely held. No tsunami warning was needed, and the systems that would have issued one if it were stood ready regardless. This is what high alert looks like in practice. It is quiet, it is competent, and it is the product of decades of taking the threat seriously instead of wishing it away. I bring this up because the thread of this whole story is not meant to leave you helpless. The knot beneath Fuji is real, the stakes are enormous, and the mountain deserves our sustained attention. But the appropriate emotional response to all of that is not dread, it is respect, and the kind of steady preparation that turns a potential catastrophe into a survivable event. The scientists watching the mountain tonight are not panicking. They are doing their jobs, running the checklist, reading the instruments, ready to raise the alarm if the data ever demands it. That calm vigilance is the model. It is how you live, sanely, on top of one of the most dangerous pieces of ground on Earth. It is worth understanding just how hard won this readiness is, because it did not appear by accident, and it is the reason the same earthquake produces wildly different outcomes in different parts of the world. Japan's building codes, among the strictest on Earth, were written in response to past catastrophes, each disaster teaching brutal lessons that got encoded into how the next generation of buildings would be designed. Skyscrapers in Tokyo are built with systems that let them sway and absorb energy rather than resist it rigidly and shatter, a philosophy of bending so as not to break. The early warning network detects the first, faster, less damaging seismic waves and races an alert ahead of the slower, destructive shaking, buying seconds that are enough to stop trains, halt surgeries, and let people brace. Children practice earthquake drills the way children elsewhere practice fire drills. None of this removes the danger. What it does is convert a given amount of shaking into a far smaller amount of death and ruin than the same shaking would cause almost anywhere else. There is something almost philosophical in the way Japan has chosen to live, and it is worth naming because it applies far beyond earthquakes. The country could have responded to its dangerous ground with denial, pretending the threat was smaller than it is, or with paralysis, treating every tremor as the beginning of the end. Instead, it chose a third path, the path of clear-eyed preparation, looking the danger full in the face and then building patiently the systems and habits that make survival the most likely outcome. That is a kind of courage that does not look like courage, because it is quiet and unglamorous and spread across decades of building codes and drills. But it is courage all the same, the courage to accept a permanent danger without being ruled by it, and it is the reason a night that could have been a catastrophe became instead a hard but survivable few hours. I think there is a lesson in that for all of us, watching from wherever we are, about how to hold the things we cannot control. The knot beneath Fuji is not going anywhere. The plates will keep colliding, the faults will keep slipping, the mountain will keep its silence until someday it does not. None of that can be wished away. But the response to an unmovable danger is not to live in terror of it, and it is not to pretend it does not exist. It is to understand it as completely as we can, to prepare for it as well as we are able, and then to go on living, watchfully, with respect rather than dread. That is what Japan models for the world on a night like this, and it is the posture I keep coming back to, because it is the only one that fits the size of what we are facing, and that contrast is the quiet lesson hidden inside a frightening night. We have all seen what happens when strong earthquakes strike places that were not built to withstand them, where older structures of unreinforced concrete and masonry collapse and bury the people inside, where a single quake can level neighborhoods and turn streets into scenes of unimaginable loss. The difference between that outcome and the outcome of these Japanese quakes is not luck, and it is not the size of the shaking. It is preparation. It is decades of investment, regulation, engineering, and public education, all aimed at the single goal of standing safely on dangerous ground. So when I tell you Japan went on high alert and absorbed these quakes without catastrophe, I am not telling you the threat was small. I am telling you that this is what it looks like when a society takes a genuine threat seriously and prepares for it with everything it has. That is not a story of fear. It is a story of competence answering danger, and it is the model for how any of us should face the things we cannot control. And there is something almost reassuring buried in the fear, if you look for it. The very fact that we can have this conversation, that we can name the plates, map the faults, list the warning signs, and watch the mountain in real time is a triumph. For most of human history, an earthquake at the foot of Fuji would have been a terrifying mystery, an omen with no explanation. Today, we understand the machine. We know why the ground moved. We know what magma would look like if it were rising, and we know it is not. We have turned a thing that once could only be feared into a thing that can be studied, monitored, and prepared for. That does not remove the danger, but it transforms our relationship to it from superstition into knowledge. Still, knowledge has an edge to it, and the thread will not let me close on pure comfort, because the most important thing knowledge gives us is the honesty to admit what we still cannot answer. We know tonight's quake was tectonic. We know the alert level has not risen. We know the checklist, so far, reads calm. But we also know that this is the most complicated tectonic knot on the planet, that it sits beneath a giant which has woken before, and that the difference between an ordinary groan of the crust and the first whisper of something larger is not always obvious in the moment it begins. That is the unresolved space where this story lives, and it is where, in the end, we have to leave it, watching, the way the instruments watch, through the dark. Let me bring it home. Part 15. The question. The mountain will not answer. So here is where we stand, in the quiet after a day when the ground moved twice. A far-down quake beneath the capital in the afternoon. A shallow quake at the foot of the sacred mountain at night. Both from the same machine, the same stack of colliding plates, the same knot that ties together the largest forces on the surface of this world. Neither was a disaster. Neither broke the country. And yet the day left an unease behind it that no single magnitude number can explain, because the unease was never really about the size of the quakes. It was about the place they happened and what that place has always known. Mount Fuji still stands tonight exactly as it has for more than 300 years. Calm, beautiful, silent, the postcard image of serenity reflected in still water. But we have spent this whole video looking underneath that image, and we know now what the serenity is sitting on. We know that the mountain grew on the meeting point of 3 plates. We know its magma is plumbed into the same engine that just shook the ground. We know it has woken before, in the shadow of a great earthquake, and thrown its ash toward the city we now call Tokyo. The calm surface and the violent machinery beneath it are the same mountain. They always have been. And on this night the machinery spoke just for a moment, and then went quiet again. I have told you, repeatedly and honestly, what the data says, and I will say it one last time, because you deserve the clear truth over the easy thrill. There is no eruption. There is no confirmed magma rising. The alert level has not changed. The checklist so far reads as a tectonic earthquake and nothing more. By every responsible measure, the most likely story is the simplest one, that the knot slipped, the crust adjusted, the aftershocks will fade, and the mountain will go on sleeping. That is not me softening the story to calm you down. That is genuinely where the evidence points tonight. There is a strange kind of intimacy in keeping watch over something that could harm you, and I think it is the truest way to describe our relationship with a mountain like this. We do not watch Fuji because we expect it to erupt tonight, or this year, or even in our lifetimes. We watch it because we have learned, through the long and sometimes painful history of this place, that the things which sleep are not the same as the things which are gone. A volcano in repose is not a dead mountain. It is a quiet one, and quiet is a state that can change. So the watching is not paranoia. It is a kind of respect, the same respect you would give to any great power that has chosen, for now, to be still. We map its faults, we sample its breath, we measure the shape of its slopes from space, not because we are afraid every night, but because we understand what it is, and we refuse to mistake its silence for its absence. And maybe that is the real meaning of a night like this one, when the ground moved twice and then went quiet again. It was not a warning as far as anyone can tell. It was a reminder. It was the knot beneath the most beautiful mountain in the world clearing its throat, just loudly enough to make a watchful nation lift its head, check its instruments, and confirm that all the signals that matter still read calm. Nothing changed in the forecast. Everything was reaffirmed in the vigil. The mountain is still sleeping, the scientists are still watching, and the machine beneath them all is still turning slowly, the way it has for millions of years and will for millions more. That is not a story that ends. It is a story that continues quietly, under our feet, whether we are paying attention or not. But the reason this story holds us, the reason I could not let you wave away a 5.6, is the question that sits underneath all of that reassurance and refuses to resolve. When the ground moves at the exact junction where subduction, collision, crustal faulting, and a sleeping volcano's magma all converge into a single tangled point, how do you ever know, in the moment, the difference between the planet simply being itself and the first faint sign of something waking up? The honest answer is that you do not know instantly. You watch, you listen, you run the checklist again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Because the only way to tell an ordinary groan from a first whisper is to keep listening long enough to find out which one it was. That is what the instruments around Mount Fuji are doing right now, in the dark, while the region sleeps. They are listening to a mountain that has kept its silence for 3 centuries, sitting on the most dangerous tectonic knot on Earth, waiting to see whether tonight's shaking fades into nothing, as it almost certainly will, or whether it was the start of a sentence the mountain has not finished speaking. We do not get to know yet. None of us do. We only get to watch, and to respect the thing we are watching, and to understand, finally, that the most beautiful mountain in the world has never once stopped being one of the most powerful. The ground moved at the foot of Fuji tonight. The mountain has not told us what it meant, and so we keep watch, and we wait for the next thing the knot decides to say.